The music echoed through the hall like a funereal whisper, each note seeming to mock the bride as she made her way down the aisle. Lila Whitmore held her head high, but inside her, every step was a battle not to crumble. The fine white lace dress that hugged her body like armor was yet another imposition from her stepmother, Margaret Whitmore. The delicate embroidery and long veil that trailed across the polished floor of the hall were not a symbol of happiness. They were golden shackles, a cruel reminder of her position in the family. The guests whispered among themselves, but Lila could hear the words as if they were whispered directly into her ear. "Poor thing," said a grey-haired woman with an arrogant posture. "Marrying a bumpkin. What a pitiful end for an heiress." "Poor thing?" retorted another with a dry laugh. "She deserved it. If she'd been less disobedient, she wouldn't have ended up like this." The murmurs burned like fire on her skin, but what hurt most was Margaret's look of pure satisfaction. Sitting in the front row, in a cobalt-blue dress that sparkled under the golden lights of the ballroom, Margaret held a glass of champagne with delicate fingers, as if celebrating her personal victory. Her lips curved into a small, cold smile, revealing everything she was thinking. I won. Margaret wasn't there to witness a wedding. She was there to watch a social execution. At the altar, Daniel Harper looked as out of place as she did. He was adjusting the black tie around his neck, clearly uncomfortable in an outfit that wasn't made for him. His hair was carefully combed, but he still looked out of place in the opulent setting. Daniel kept his head down, as if trying to escape the judgmental stares that weighed on him like an impending storm. But for Margaret, public humiliation was only the beginning. She had orchestrated everything with surgical precision, choosing not only the guests who would ensure the scandal, but also the perfect timing to maximize the impact. She knew that the local newspapers would soon run headlines mocking the rebellious heiress who had been forced to marry a worker with no means. For Margaret, that marriage was more than a punishment for Lila. It was a show of control, a demonstration of power. Margaret leaned in slightly as Lila passed her, her words an icy whisper. "Remember, darling, one false step and your father pays the price." The words were like poison dripping straight into Lila's soul. She didn't need any more reminders of why she was there. Her father, James Whitmore, was bedridden on the top floor of the mansion, completely dependent on medical care. Margaret controlled everything, the resources, the nurses, even the medicines. The blackmail was clear and direct. Lila had to obey, or her father would be abandoned to his fate. At the altar, Daniel Harper could hardly stand still. He adjusted the black tie that seemed to suffocate him, trying to avoid the gaze of the guests. The clothes he was wearing had been given to him by one of Margaret's employees, a clearly expensive suit, but one that didn't fit his body. He knew he looked out of place, like a fish out of water in a shark tank. Daniel had never wanted to be there. Margaret had put him up against the wall. A week earlier, she had called him into the mansion's luxurious office for a chat. "Daniel, you're a dedicated worker, but make no mistake." Margaret had spoken while crossing her legs and holding a glass of wine. "Your position here is fragile. I could have you out of here at any moment." He tried to argue, but Margaret interrupted him, her tone becoming even more cutting. "Either you marry Lila or you lose everything. Cabin, job, livelihood. And I guarantee that no other employer in Montana will want to hire you. I have friends everywhere." The words echoed in his mind as he looked at Lila, who now stood beside him at the altar. He knew that she was also a victim in that story, but knowing that didn't make the situation any less humiliating. Margaret watched everything as if she were a director, satisfied with the execution of her play. She had planned every detail of the wedding. From Daniel's outfit to the guest list, Everything was a show of power. For Margaret, that wedding wasn't just a punishment for Lila. It was a show to consolidate her control over anyone who dared defy her. The guests, many of them members of Helena's high society, watched with a mixture of fascination and derision. They knew that Margaret was the real force behind the event, but no one dared to challenge her openly. As the officiant began the ceremony, Margaret took a sip of champagne, relaxing even more. Nothing could go wrong now. Lila and Daniel exchanged a brief glance. There was shame, anger, and resignation in their eyes. They were both trapped in that situation, but there was also a glimmer of solidarity. It was as if, at that moment, they recognized that they were in this battle together, even if it was against their will. The officiant began to speak, but the words were just a hum to Lila. She felt the air in the hall grow heavier by the second. What would happen after that wedding? How could she bear to live through that farce? Then something changed on Daniel's face. He took a deep breath and raised his head. There was something different in his eyes now. A spark of determination was beginning to take shape, something Margaret hadn't anticipated. The ceremony had only just begun, but the fate of that forced union was about to change in an unexpected way. The story of Lila Whitmore and Daniel Harper doesn't begin at the altar. It begins much earlier, on separate paths that were eventually forced to cross by Margaret Whitmore's cruel manipulation. To understand the weight of what happened in that room, it was necessary to go back and unravel who they were and how they got there. Lila Whitmore grew up surrounded by wealth, but she never felt free. Her childhood was marked by the absence of her mother, who died when she was just 8, and the emotional distance from her father, James Whitmore, an oil tycoon who devoted more time to business than to his family. James always wanted the best for Lila, but his vision of best was limited to providing a life of luxury and protection. He didn't realize that his daughter longed for something that no amount of money could buy: freedom. When James remarried Margaret, Lila was 15. At first, Margaret seemed attentive, trying to fill the role of stepmother with superficial gestures of affection. But it soon became clear that her kindness was just a facade. Margaret was a cunning woman, obsessed with power and status, and saw Lila as an obstacle to be controlled. Margaret soon laid down strict rules for Lila, molding her life into a spectacle of obedience. Every step Lila took, every choice she tried to make, was supervised or sabotaged by her stepmother. Worse still, Margaret used James's emotional absence as a weapon. She had convinced him that Lila needed discipline, not affection, and used this idea to manipulate the relationship between father and daughter. Despite everything, Lila found ways to resist. Whenever she could, she escaped the grand parties and elite gatherings to visit the workers at Whitmore Farm. It was there, between the stables and the hayfields, that she felt most connected to the real world. She listened to the workers' stories, helped out in any way she could, and sometimes distributed part of her pocket money to those who needed it most. That's how she met Daniel Harper. Daniel Harper grew up in very different conditions. Abandoned as a baby, he was raised in crowded orphanages and temporary foster homes. From an early age, he learned that life didn't offer anything for free. He worked on farms from the time he was a teenager, moving from town to town, trying to find a place to call home. When he arrived at Whitmore Farm, Daniel finally felt he could create something stable. The work was hard, but he had a simple cabin to live in and a job that paid enough to get by. Most importantly, he loved working with the horses, caring for them as if they were his family. Daniel was known for his work ethic and altruism. Even with little, he made a point of helping the other workers on the farm, offering what he had. He was respected by his colleagues, but invisible to his bosses, until Lila came along. It was on a particularly hot day that Lila and Daniel exchanged their first words. Lila was walking through the stables, trying to escape yet another etiquette lesson imposed by Margaret. She spotted him in the distance. carrying bales of hay with ease, sweat dripping down his face as he worked under the sun. "You look tired," she said, coming closer. Daniel, taken by surprise, looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. He wasn't used to talking to his bosses, especially the owner's daughter. "It's part of the job," he replied, without stopping. "That doesn't mean you shouldn't rest." Lila handed him a bottle of water she was carrying. Daniel hesitated before accepting it. But what surprised him most was the look in her eyes. There was no judgment, only genuine concern. From that moment on, the two began to talk occasionally. They weren't friends, but there was a mutual respect. Lila admired Daniel's resilience, and he saw in her something he never expected in someone of her position: humanity. But it didn't take Margaret long to notice the growing connection between Lila and Daniel, and like everything that got out of hand, it needed to be destroyed. One afternoon, Margaret found Lila delivering new clothes to the farm workers. The donations were part of a secret project that Lila had started, using part of her allowance to buy clothes and food for the employees. "What do you think you're doing?" Margaret's voice sounded as cold as ice, making Lila freeze. "I'm helping," replied Lila, trying to keep her composure. "Helping?" Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in her tone. "You're demeaning yourself. That's unacceptable. It's the government that has to help the poor. We already do a lot by paying their salaries. Let them fend for themselves. I don't want you involved with these people." Margaret used the episode to create a narrative that could justify harsher punishments. She told James that Lila was getting too involved with the servants, implying that this could tarnish the family's reputation. When Margaret realized that Lila wouldn't give in to her manipulation so easily, she decided she needed a definitive lesson, and Daniel was the perfect fit for her strategy. He was the opposite of everything Lila should have wanted by Margaret's standards. Forcing Lila to marry Daniel would be the public humiliation she believed necessary to bend her stepdaughter. For Daniel, Margaret devised an even crueler game. She knew that he valued his cottage and his work on the farm, so she made him a simple and brutal offer. Either he agreed to the marriage, or he would be thrown out, losing everything he had achieved. Margaret believed she had absolute control over both of them. To her, Lila and Daniel were just pawns on her board. What she didn't know was that her manipulation was about to create something she couldn't have foreseen, the two of them uniting against a common enemy. Margaret Whitmore had always been a woman driven by one goal: absolute power. Ever since she had married James Whitmore, her life had been a constant dance of manipulation, control, and calculated strategies. She knew that power came not just from wealth, but from dominance over the people around her. Lila, her stepdaughter, was the last piece that needed to be subdued. Her rebellious spirit and empathy for inferiors not only irritated Margaret, but posed a threat to her carefully constructed empire. It was one sunny morning, as Margaret sipped her tea on the veranda of the Whitmore mansion, that the idea occurred to her. Marriage would be the final blow. She needed something that would humiliate Lila, destroy her image of goodness, and place her under her total dependence. At the same time, she needed someone who could be manipulated, someone who could be easily discarded when their usefulness ran out. Daniel Harper was the perfect match. Margaret started the game by calling Daniel into her office. The atmosphere was oppressive, with dark wooden walls, leather furniture, and the air impregnated with the strong perfume she always wore. Daniel entered hesitantly, wiping his boots before stepping onto the luxurious carpet. He didn't know why he'd been called, but he had a feeling it wouldn't be a good thing. "Mr. Harper, sit down," said Margaret, her voice as sharp as a blade. Daniel obeyed, but remained rigid, the posture of a man used to taking orders. "How long have you worked here? 2 years, right?" She crossed her legs and analyzed him as if she were appraising an object of little value. "Yes, ma'am." "And you like the job?" Yes, Mum, it's a good place. A good place, she repeated, as if savouring the words. Well, that's good to know, because I have an offer for you. The tone of her voice changed, and Daniel felt a chill run up his spine. He knew something was wrong. Margaret wasn't known for making proposals that benefited others. I want you to marry Lila, she said abruptly, bluntly. Daniel's eyes widened, surprise giving way to confusion. With all due respect, Ma'am, I don't think that's... It's not up to you to think anything, Mr. Harper, Margaret interrupted, leaning back in her chair. I'm giving you a unique opportunity. A marriage to my stepdaughter will ensure that you remain here with your cottage, your job, and perhaps a little comfort. Daniel remained silent, trying to understand the logic of this. Margaret continued, But if you refuse, well, let's just say that your hut will be emptied in 24 hours. I'll have no problem finding another worker to replace you. Madam, why me? Because you're convenient, she said, smiling coldly, and because I need Lila to learn that her actions have consequences. Daniel wanted to protest, but he knew he had no choice. He had nowhere else to go. Margaret had put him in an impossible position. While Margaret manipulated Daniel, she prepared the ground to force Lila to accept the marriage. Her approach to Lila was even crueler. She chose a moment when Lila was at her most vulnerable, after a visit to her father's room, where he was resting, frail and dependent on medical care. Lila went downstairs with her eyes watering, but found Margaret waiting for her in the main hall, with a smile that didn't suit the occasion. Oh dear, I need to talk to you. Lila tried to ignore her, but Margaret blocked her way. Sit down, Lila. You don't want to hear this standing up. Lila hesitated but obeyed, crossing her arms in a gesture of defense. What now? It's about your future, Margaret began with a tone of false concern. You're of marriageable age, you know that, and I have the perfect solution for you. Lila frowned, already sensing that this would not be a good thing. I want you to marry Daniel Harper. Lila blinked in disbelief. What? You've got to be kidding me, you've got to be kidding. I'm not kidding. He's a man. Well, he's exactly the kind of husband a woman like you deserves. That's absurd. Lila stood up, but Margaret remained motionless, her expression hardening. It's not a suggestion, Lila. It's an order. You can't make me do it. You can't. Margaret leaned forward, her voice becoming colder. Guy, what if I told you that I would abandon your father if you didn't, that he'd be dumped in some clinic far away from you? Don't forget that as long as he's debilitated, I'm in control of the family's money. The words cut Lila like a knife. You wouldn't do that. Try challenging me, darling, and you'll see what I'm capable of. Lila felt the tears burning in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She knew that Margaret was perfectly capable of carrying out her threats. Why are you doing this? Lila asked, her voice trembling. Because you need to learn to stay in your place. You have foolish ideas about helping people like Daniel, so I thought it appropriate that he should be your husband. Let's see if you're still as generous when you're living in his hut. Lila felt the ground collapse beneath her feet. There was no way out. Margaret began the wedding preparations with ruthless efficiency. She made a point of turning the event into a public spectacle, inviting only people who could spread the word and ensure that Lila's humiliation was complete. She oversaw every detail. Lila's dress, Daniel's suit, the lavish decorations that contrasted with the groom's simplicity. Nothing was left to chance. During the days leading up to the wedding, Margaret made a point of reinforcing her control. Lila was constantly reminded of her powerlessness, while Daniel was treated as a disposable tool. At a family dinner, Margaret made a point of mocking them both. Daniel, I hope you're prepared to teach Lila how to be a good wife. I don't think she knows how to make a boiled egg. The guests laughed, but Lila and Daniel remained silent, both bearing the brunt of their humiliation. On the day of the wedding, Margaret was overjoyed. She had planned everything to perfection. The ceremony would be the culmination of her revenge against Lila. As she watched the guests settle into the hall, Margaret took a sip of champagne, satisfied. Nothing could go wrong now. But somewhere, in the back of her mind, a small shadow of doubt began to form. Something was about to change. The morning of the wedding dawned with a clear sky and a light breeze that made the fields around Whitmore Manor dance. The mansion had been bustling since early morning, with servants rushing around to ensure that every detail of the ceremony was impeccable. Margaret, as always, was in control, moving through the corridors with the precision of a general commanding her army. For Lila and Daniel, however, that day held no promise of joy. Lila was in her room, staring at the wedding dress that hung from a golden hanger as a symbol of her defeat. Daniel, on the other hand, was in the cottage he called home, sitting on the edge of his bed, trying to gather the strength to face what was to come. It was in this context that Ethel Sage arrived at the farm. Ethel was an elderly woman with white hair and slow steps, but her eyes still shone with a liveliness that belied her age. She had worked for Jeremiah Maynard, Margaret's first husband, decades ago. After years of living in another town, she had heard rumors about Lila's marriage to Daniel Harper, and something had bothered her deeply. When Ethel arrived at the farm, no one paid much attention to her. The servants were too busy, and the guests hadn't started arriving yet. She knew she had to find Daniel before it was too late. After discreetly asking one of the servants where he was, Ethel went to the cottage. When she knocked on the door, Daniel opened it with a confused expression. "Ma'am, can I help you?" "Are you Daniel Harper?" asked Ethel, her voice shaky but full of urgency. "Yes, I am. Who are you, ma'am?" "My name is Ethel Sage. I worked for Jeremiah Maynard, Margaret Whitmore's first husband. I need to speak to you, in private." Daniel hesitated, but something in Ethel's tone convinced him to let her in. The cottage was simple but clean, with few furnishings and an air of modesty that reflected the life of its occupant. Ethel sat down in a chair while Daniel stood restlessly. "I'll come straight to the point, young man. Do you know anything about your family?" asked Ethel, staring at him intensely. "No, I've never known. I was abandoned in an orphanage as a baby. That's all I know." Ethel took a deep breath, as if she was preparing to say something she had been carrying around for years. "I recognized you as soon as I saw a picture of you in the local paper. You look like Jeremiah Maynard in his youth." "There's no denying that." Daniel frowned, trying to understand. "Jeremiah Maynard. Who is he?" "He was Margaret's first husband. A good man, but naive. He trusted her, and paid dearly for it. When Jeremiah died, they said it was a heart attack, but I always suspected that Margaret had something to do with it. He had a baby at the time, a boy who disappeared shortly after his death. Margaret said that the baby had died too, but I never believed her." Daniel felt his heart racing. "Are you saying that I am that baby?" "Yes, I am." Ethel held his hands, her eyes watering. "You are Daniel Maynard, Jeremiah's son, and Margaret abandoned you to take his inheritance." Ethel's words echoed in Daniel's mind like thunder. He felt a whirlwind of emotions, anger, sadness, and a strange sense of relief at finally having an answer as to where he came from. "She abandoned me," he muttered, trying to process the information. "And now she wants to use me again, as a piece in her game." Ethel nodded, squeezing his hand. "I can't prove all this right now, but I know it's true. And you can go back and do a DNA test with your relatives to prove it. But I'm sure of it. You would never confuse me. You're identical to your father. The important thing is that you know who you are. Margaret has always manipulated everyone around her, but the time has come for someone to stand up to her." Daniel took a deep breath, feeling a determination grow inside him. He didn't know how he was going to stand up to Margaret, but he knew he had to do something. Daniel spent the next few hours in silence, reflecting on what he had just discovered. While the servants came to collect him for the wedding preparations, he followed the instructions like an automaton, but inside his mind was racing. He needed a plan. When he arrived at the mansion, Daniel avoided Margaret. He couldn't face her yet. He knew she would realize something was different if she looked into his eyes. Instead, he concentrated on what he needed to do. Meanwhile, Ethel walked around the farmland, observing everything around her. She knew she couldn't expose Margaret immediately. She would need a decisive moment to ensure that everyone heard the truth. Hours before the ceremony, Daniel met Lila for the first time that day. She was in her dressing room, adjusting her dress with the help of a maid. When she saw Daniel enter, she dismissed the maid, hoping he had something to say. "What do you want?" asked Lila, without hiding her bitterness. Daniel hesitated, but finally answered, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. For everything." Lila laughed, but there was no humor in her laughter. "You didn't set this up, Daniel. There's nothing to apologize for." "Not yet," he said, more to himself than to her. Lila stared at him, puzzled, but Daniel didn't explain. He just left, leaving her alone to ponder what his words might mean. Daniel knew that the ceremony would be the ideal moment to expose Margaret. With the guests gathered, she would have no way of escaping the accusations. He didn't have all the evidence, but he knew that the truth was strong enough to start bringing down the empire of manipulation she had built. While he waited for the moment to act, the last details of the wedding were being adjusted, and Margaret continued to smile, unaware that the carefully constructed world around her was about to collapse. The ceremony hall was filled with an atmosphere of false grandeur. The guests occupied the elegantly arranged seats, murmuring among themselves as the soft sound of strings filled the room. The ceremony was about to begin. Margaret, in her prominent chair in the front row, exuded confidence. Everything was going exactly as she had planned. Daniel stood at the altar as still as a statue, but his insides were a whirlwind of emotions. Ethel's revelation a few hours earlier had left him shaken, but it had also given him a strength he had never felt before. He knew that this was the moment to end Margaret's cycle of manipulation, and he would do it in front of everyone. Lila appeared at the entrance to the hall. The music ceased, replaced by a reverent silence. All eyes turned to her, the bride dragging her white dress down the red carpet. She looked beautiful, but her expression was hard, almost defiant. To the guests, it seemed as if she was just accepting her fate. To Daniel, who was watching her closely, it was obvious that she was also feeling the humiliation of every step. When Lila reached the altar, she and Daniel exchanged a brief glance. He wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. It wasn't time yet. Lila noticed what seemed to be a glimmer of compassion on Daniel's face, but looked away. She knew that he too was a prisoner in that situation. The officiant began the ceremony, his words echoing through the decorated hall. Daniel listened, but his mind was focused on what he needed to do. He looked at Margaret, who was smiling in her chair. She seemed completely in control, but Daniel knew that smile wouldn't last long. When the officiant asked the two grooms to hold hands, Daniel swallowed. He looked at Lila, and this time he spoke in a low voice, almost a whisper. "Trust me." Lila frowned, confused, but didn't have time to reply. Daniel released her hands and stepped forward, turning to the guests. The hall fell silent again, but now it was a silence fraught with tension. The confrontation begins. "Before this ceremony continues, there is something everyone here needs to know," said Daniel, his voice firm but with palpable emotion. The murmurs started immediately. Margaret stood up from her chair, the smile disappearing from her face. "What do you think you're doing?" she asked, her voice full of authority, but with an underlying tone of desperation. Daniel ignored her, continuing to talk to the guests. Margaret Whitmore is not the woman you think she is. She's a manipulator, a liar, and worst of all, a criminal." The murmurs intensified. Margaret stepped forward, trying to take control of the situation. "This is absurd!" she shouted. "Get on with the ceremony." Daniel raised his hand, interrupting her. "No, you're not going to shut me up this time, not after what I found out." He took a deep breath before continuing, looking directly at the guests. "My name is Daniel Harper, or at least that's how I've always known myself. But today I discovered something that Margaret tried to keep from all of you. I'm not just a worker on this farm. I am Daniel Maynard, son of Jeremiah Maynard, her first husband." The shock was immediate. The murmurs turned into audible exclamations as the guests exchanged confused glances. Margaret turned pale, her hands trembling slightly. Margaret tried to defend herself. "This is ridiculous," said Margaret, her voice trembling. "He's lying!" Daniel turned to her, pointing with his finger. "Am I lying? Then why did Ethel Sage, who worked for your first husband, recognize me? Why did she know that you abandoned his son in an orphanage to take his inheritance?" The guests turned to Margaret, their gazes now full of suspicion. Margaret tried to pull herself together, adjusting her dress. "That woman is a delusional old woman, and you're nothing but an ingrate trying to destroy my reputation." Daniel took a step towards her, his voice rising. "Your reputation, is that what you care about? You stole the life of the very son of the man who trusted you. You threw me into an orphanage and then tried to use my life again for your dirty games." Lila enters the fray. As the tension rose, Lila finally found her voice. "Is this true, Margaret?" she asked, taking a few steps forward. Margaret looked at Lila, her eyes pleading now. "Lila, darling, don't listen to him. He's trying to destroy me out of jealousy." But Lila wasn't fooled. Something in Daniel's tone, in the firmness of his story, convinced her that he was telling the truth. "You used me. You used us, all to satisfy your need for power," said Lila, her voice full of emotion. Margaret tried to speak, but her voice failed her. The guests began to rise, many muttering that the police should be called. Daniel struck the final blow. "You kept me here because you thought I was weak. You thought you could go on controlling my life, but it's over for you, Margaret. It's over." Margaret finally lost her composure. "I did what I needed to do to survive," she shouted, her voice full of despair. "You all judge me, but you don't know what it's like to fight for what's yours." But her words fell on deaf ears. The guests had already drawn their conclusions, and the truth was clear. As Margaret was surrounded by accusing stares, Ethel emerged from the back of the room, confirming everything Daniel had said. "I saw what she did. I knew she had abandoned the baby, but I never had the courage to speak out. I didn't know where to find it. Until now." The shock was absolute. Margaret tried to leave, but was prevented by her own guests. The police were called, and Margaret was led out of the mansion, now a broken woman, with no more masks to hide her actions. Daniel and Lila remained at the altar, both relieved, but still processing everything that had happened. The ceremony hall, which had once been filled with malicious whispers and smiles of false courtesy, was now a whirlwind of chaos. High-ranking guests, socialites, and local businessmen looked at each other with expressions of shock and incredulity, while Margaret Whitmore, who had always reigned over them with an imposing presence, was in a state of complete humiliation. "This is an outrage!" Margaret shouted as she tried to dodge the accusations. "You're judging me on lies!" But the evidence was clear. Ethel Sage, Jeremiah Maynard's former maid, walked to the center of the hall with firm steps, despite her advanced age. She raised her head, her firm voice cutting through the air like a blade. "I worked for Jeremiah for years. I saw the love he had for his son, and I saw how Margaret used that love to manipulate and destroy everything he had built. She abandoned the baby in an orphanage because she wanted the whole fortune for herself. That's the truth. The once respectful and admiring glances directed at Margaret were now cold and judgmental. Some of the guests stood up, whispering amongst themselves. One middle-aged man, who had clearly known Margaret for years, shook his head and said aloud, "So it was all true. I've always wondered how she rose so quickly in life." Margaret desperately turned to Lila, trying to regain any trace of control. "Lila, darling, you know this is all a conspiracy. I've always done my best for this family, for your father." But Lila, for the first time in a long time, faced Margaret without fear. "You've done what's best for yourself, Margaret. It's always been that way. You manipulated my father. You manipulated me, and now you've tried to do the same with Daniel. But it's over." As the tension grew, one of the guests discreetly called the police. A few minutes later, 2 officers entered the hall, their presence bringing an even heavier silence. Margaret recoiled, despair evident on her face. "This is a mistake. I'm a Whitmore," she shouted, trying to resist as the officers approached. "Margaret Maynard," said one of the officers, deliberately using the name of her first marriage. "You are being held on suspicion of fraud, child abandonment and other crimes which will be investigated. Please cooperate." Margaret looked around, searching for allies among the guests, but found no one willing to defend her. Her mask of control and power had fallen, and she was now just a woman alone, exposed for her crimes. "You don't know who you're dealing with," she shouted as she was escorted out of the hall. When the doors closed behind her, the hall was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, the guests started talking again, shock giving way to curiosity and gossip. Meanwhile, Daniel and Lila stood at the altar, watching everything unfold. Daniel felt a mixture of relief and sadness. He finally had the truth about his origins, but it came with an immense weight. He knew that his life would never be the same. Lila, on the other hand, felt something she hadn't experienced for a long time: hope. Without Margaret, she finally had the chance to rebuild her life, away from the constant manipulation and humiliation. She looked at Daniel, who seemed lost in thought. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. Daniel took a deep breath before answering. "I don't know. I guess I'm still trying to make sense of it all. But thank you, Lila, for believing in me." Lila gave a small smile. "I think we both deserve a fresh start." The news about Margaret spread quickly through Helena. The former society queen was formally charged with several crimes, including fraud and child abandonment. During the investigations, more evidence emerged of her manipulation of Jeremiah Maynard and her plot to seize his fortune. With her empire crumbling, Margaret lost everything. Her fortune was confiscated, and she faced the real possibility of spending the rest of her life in prison. Those who had once fawned over her now avoided any association with her. Without Margaret, Whitmore Manor became a very different place. James Whitmore, who was becoming increasingly frail, finally received the proper care that Margaret had neglected. He, although devastated by the revelations about his wife, found comfort in the fact that Lila and Daniel were there to support him. Daniel, now recognized as Daniel Maynard, officially received the rights to the inheritance that Margaret had tried to steal. But he wasn't interested in wealth or status. He and Lila decided to use the fortune for something greater, to help those who, like Daniel, had been abandoned or neglected. Together they began working on charity projects, building orphanages, and offering support to communities in need. They transformed what was once a story of suffering into a journey of hope and redemption. Whitmore Farm, once the scene of manipulation and humiliation, was now a place of rebuilding. The opulence that once symbolized Margaret's absolute power had disappeared, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. Lila and Daniel turned the estate into a center for charitable activities, opening its doors to those who needed help. The sun shone brightly that morning, bathing the fields in golden hues. Daniel, now officially recognized as Daniel Maynard, was in the stables feeding the horses. Despite being the rightful heir to a considerable fortune, he hadn't abandoned his simplicity. He continued to work with his hands, remembering his origins and the importance of staying connected to the land that had been his only security for so long. Lila approached him, observing him for a moment before entering the stable. He was dressed in simple clothes, but his countenance was one of serenity, something he hadn't felt for years. "It looks like you'll never leave this place," she joked, leaning against the door. Daniel smiled, a genuine smile that was becoming more common on his face. "I don't think so. There's something about looking after horses that helps me think." Lila nodded, understanding perfectly. She herself found solace in walking through the fields, away from the formality that had once dominated her life. The mansion, which had once been just a display of wealth, was now buzzing with activity. One of the large halls had been converted into a temporary orphanage, while construction of a new building was being completed on a nearby plot. Children ran around the garden, laughing and playing, filling the space with life and joy. Lila was leading the charitable initiatives alongside Daniel. Together, they had decided that Jeremiah Maynard's fortune should be used to give opportunities to those, like Daniel, who never had a fair start. But the work wasn't just about charity. It was about creating a different legacy, one that wasn't rooted in control and manipulation. As they walked to Margaret's old office, now transformed into an administrative center for the projects, Daniel turned to Lila. "Did you imagine we'd be here working together?" he asked, still with a hint of disbelief in his voice. "Never," replied Lila, smiling slightly. "But I also never imagined that I would find freedom in the place where I felt most trapped." Over time, the connection between Lila and Daniel began to deepen. Initially, they had worked together out of circumstance, but soon discovered that they shared similar values. They both understood what it was like to be a prisoner of a larger system and felt a genuine responsibility to create change. One quiet evening, as they sat on the veranda of the mansion, watching the stars, Daniel broke the silence. "You know, when Margaret forced me into this marriage, I thought it would be the worst day of my life." Lila laughed softly without bitterness. "So did I." Daniel turned to her, his gaze softer. "But now, I can't imagine being anywhere else or with anyone else." Lila felt her face flush, but she didn't look away. "Neither can I." That night marked a new chapter for both of them. It was no longer a forced partnership, but a conscious choice to walk together. Over the following months, Lila and Daniel consolidated their vision. The farm became a model for social initiatives in the region. They founded a formal orphanage, a community school, and a support program for farm workers, offering education and resources that were previously inaccessible. Local society, previously full of gossip and judgment, began to see them in a new light. The headlines that had previously ridiculed Lila and Daniel's marriage now extolled their achievements. Lila, who had always lived under the shadow of Margaret's oppression, finally found her voice. She became a respected leader, speaking at events and defending social causes. Daniel, for his part, used his personal story as an inspiration to others, showing that even the most difficult beginnings can lead to great transformations. One golden afternoon, months after Margaret's fall, Daniel and Lila walked together to the top of a hill on the farm. From the top, they could see the fields, the mansion, and the new buildings they had erected. "Look what we've built," said Lila, her eyes shining with excitement. "We didn't just build, we rebuilt," corrected Daniel, placing his hand on hers. They sat in silence for a moment, just enjoying the view and the significance of everything they had overcome. "I guess, in a way, we can thank Margaret," said Lila with a tone of irony. Daniel laughed. Maybe, but not for who she was, but for what we've learned from her. Lila smiled, leaning slightly against him. Never again will we allow someone like her to control our lives. Daniel nodded. Never again. As the sun began to set, the two of them stood there, united not only by the pain they had faced, but by the hope of what was yet to come. Lila and Daniel's story became a symbol of overcoming and resilience. They transformed a narrative of manipulation and pain into a journey of redemption and purpose. Together, they created a future that not only freed them, but also opened doors for others. And so, in the place where Margaret once ruled with tyranny, something much greater now flourished, a community guided by compassion, justice, and love.